All right. I hope everyone can hear me loud and clear. So good morning, good evening, everybody who's joining us today. I'm so happy to be here and to be hosting this fireside chat with a really good thought leader in the privacy space, Petros Efstathopoulos. I wanted to quickly introduce myself, give you guys a little bit of background before we dive in. So Petros currently serves as the global head of research at NortonLifeLock Research Group here and is here to talk about data privacy, everything to do with enterprise and consumer challenges, and specifically focus a little bit around what data privacy means on the web. So to start this conversation, just a quick introduction of the problem. So I think we're all very well aware and just inundated with stories about privacy breaches. There's ransomware attacks and sort of the lack of preparedness overall that enterprises have to tackle these sorts of attacks today. And CISOs and their challenges and what they're tasked with around how to balance security needs, privacy needs, and more importantly, their business needs, right? How marketing teams that are so dependent on applications like chatbot agents and analytics tool, how are they opening up their enterprise websites to privacy risks and security risks? And now I think on top of that, there are all these added challenges around regulatory requirements and how you can be compliant with the CCPAs and GDPRs of the world. And more importantly, I think the bottom line is really how are we protecting consumer data as enterprises, as folks in the cybersecurity world. So given this new world, I think this was timely, this discussion, and I'm really happy that Petros took our invitation to kind of be part of this Q&A. So without further ado, Petros, I'd love to hear a little bit about yourself and just introduce yourself, and then we can go into sort of the fireside chat itself and then open it up to Q&A at the very end.
Great. Thanks for having me. Thanks for the introduction, Deepika. So as an introduction, I would say that I've been with NortonLifeLock and previously Symantec for about 12 years now, always working within the office of CTO and the research team. I'm currently leading that team. I'm very privileged in that respect, working with some very bright people. And the work we do there is essentially aiming at inventing the future of security, privacy, identity, and all adjacent areas. So a lot of the innovation we produce actually makes it to products. A lot of the core technologies that are in the products have actually started at some point or another as labs projects. But even those that don't make it to products are essentially trying to shape the landscape of this space in the future, right? And privacy and all the implications related to privacy, including security implications, identity implications, and all of these adjacencies is something that's been very, very central to our agenda, our research agenda as of recently in one way or another, whether we're looking at the data side of it, whether we're looking at PII side and so on, and many problems there to think about, both from the consumer standpoints as well as the enterprise standpoint. But right now we're focusing mostly on consumers.
That makes sense, Petros, and thank you for that introduction. I think you hit on all the right keywords, right? Privacy, identity, PII, data. And it's funny you say that. So when I was researching for this chat, I was looking at some of the research you and the team had done. And I came across this paper in 2015, so a little over 6 years ago, that you worked on, but that's completely relevant today. It's the Track Advisor paper that you had. Yeah. You spoke about widespread third-party tracking, specifically cookies. Not much has changed today. So we publish this report every year. We've seen the same, where there's over 31 to 35 third parties on average on a site. Over 15, 20 of them have access to sensitive data. So what do you see that has changed over the years, and what kind of prompted you to, even in terms of that research that you've done, prompted you to take that research forward and some of the work that you've done in the cookie tracking space specifically?
Right. So the paper you quoted was published back in 2015, but the work actually happened years sooner. And it was the beginning of what we see today, the beginning of browsers and websites trying to fingerprint users one way or the other, or create a tracking ecosystem. And at the time, it was a very, I don't want to say alarming, but it was a very interesting observation. And it's interesting because back in 2012, when that work started, privacy and web tracking were not on people's radar as an issue, right? We had other issues to deal with that were truly important. I'm not saying that they were not, but at the time, we definitely didn't have all these regulations we have today. The problem was not as attracting as much interest. And also the ecosystem that exists today that monetizes tracking and monetizes data the way it does, and essentially moving the entire internet sort of economy forward, did not exist in such an advanced manner, right? So since then, in certain ways, you could say that we haven't seen much difference, but in other ways, you could say that there's been a ton of difference. The systems and the networks that are there in order to do this type of tracking have gone through various stages of evolution. They're now much, much more sophisticated. The companies are acknowledging the issue, and they're trying to propose other methods that may, have other kinds of safeguards in place and whatnot. The governments are definitely acknowledging the issue, and they're trying to see how this can be regulated or otherwise kind of produce some sort of safety net or guardrails for consumers and businesses. And it's kind of a difficult balance, right? It's a difficult balance to produce some sort of framework where the consumers and the customers are being protected well enough, while at the same time businesses are allowed to thrive and move forward. The one thing that kind of is a good testament to the fact that the problem persists and becomes more and more complicated. Since you quoted that paper we published, I'm going to sort of return the favor in a way and say that we just had another publication at IEEE Security and Privacy that describes kind of the state of the art right now. It was actually presented, a couple of weeks ago, and I would invite you and everyone who's interested to go and check it out, because the ecosystem now, not only is it there, it's just like so much more complex and difficult to track.
Right.
So in the effort to help people manage all that, we are continuing the effort and the research in this space.
Yeah, no, and I think you hit on the bullet, right? It's gotten more complex. At the same time, businesses, they've monetized this, and that's the way to move the internet forward. So that's sort of the ecosystem that it's almost like they've self-propagated that ecosystem so they can continue to do business. And I think that's where it's really interesting, when we talk about the convergence of privacy and security, it's sort of one and the same now because of all of these needs that have arose to run your business, keep, customers happy on your website. You also need to make sure that you're protecting their data. And every single day you look at not just stories about breaches, but even the Googles of the world, how they're trying to change that system, right? With this flock that they have with cookies and all of that. So really, what do you think, me as a consumer, if I wear my consumer hat, what, if anything, has changed the past few years for consumers? And what, if anything, can I do as a consumer to make sure my data is protected? I know it's a loaded question, but are there steps, are there things we can be more aware of as a consumer here?
Yeah, absolutely. It's the one thing that we see for sure, which is kind of the driving principle for our vision, is that this whole ecosystem has become incredibly difficult for consumers to manage and understand. Almost impossible, right? I've spent 20 plus years looking at this ecosystem as a student, later on my graduate school, and as a professional. And if you ask me today about what companies know about me or where my data sits, I don't know. And,
right.
and you could consider me an expert in this, and I still don't know, let alone somebody like my mother. There's very little that they can say about their interactions online and their data and the safety of their data and so on. So when we started this research and we started seeing the magnitude and the complexity of the problem, we started shaping this vision with my research team, where we basically have two primary goals, right? So obviously we want to do as best as we can in order to protect and detect threats and proactively stop them. Mm-hmm. But we've reached a point where this is not enough, right? We reached a point where we want to go beyond detection and protection. We want to go into the space of enablement. Enablement is key in every element of this problem. What does enablement mean? For consumers, enablement means providing them with enough visibility that, it doesn't overwhelm them on one hand, but on the other hand, it allows them to make smarter decisions for themselves. If you want to put your social security number on Facebook, I cannot stop you, but I can enable you to make a better decision by giving you all the information that's necessary to make that decision. When it comes to enterprises and businesses, a similar model applies as well. So we need to provide the enterprises with all the tools and all the means that are necessary to them to make good decisions, to make decisions that are wise when it comes to their customers' data and the policies that they employ, without hurting their business model. Mm-hmm. And there are ways to do that, and there are technical advancements that allow us to do that, even at the enterprise level. I would say especially at the enterprise level, in terms of how you manage data, how you manage data flows and storage and this and that. We have tools to do that. We just need to take that next step into the enablement space.
Absolutely, absolutely. And go ahead, Petros. I didn't mean to interrupt you. Go ahead.
No. I was just going to say that in most of these cases, the key, I know this vision is quite high level, and then if you sit and think about it and you try to let's say apply it into more practical terms, right? What does this mean? Thinking about it, you end up realizing that in order to do any of this, whether it is warning or whether it is policy enforcement or managing data or whatever not, the primary key you need at any point in time is some sort of control point, right? It's all about control in a good way, making decisions and allowing people to make smart decisions requires some sort of control. So depending on the case, depending on the use case and the environment, you just need to pick the right control point for that next generation of applications that protect data. Right?
Yeah, that makes sense. And I'm just thinking back, right? So there are a couple of things I can think of. If I'm a novice and I'm getting on a website for the first time, I get all these cookie banners, right? I think it's kind of gotten to the point where it's annoying now. I just blindly say yes, yes, or no, no, depending on what kind of cookies. So in some sense, it's giving me control as a consumer and where my data or what data is going to be accessed. Beyond that, it's kind of blind faith to make sure that the enterprises are doing something. If I look on the flip side in terms of the enterprises and what you spoke about in terms of enablement or control, there are a number of sort of applications that you can have in terms of that control point, right? There's security controls, like we do things around, web controls like content security policy, where then the enterprise can say, okay, these are the allow lists or the deny lists based on vendors, all of that. But beyond that, I still feel like before you even get to that point, enterprises are still sort of struggling with who's allowed, who these vendors are, what the data flows might be, what we're collecting with, right? So I think when you talk about the convergence, there is a sense of, yes, there needs to be enablement tools, but before you even get to that, I think a lot of enterprises, unfortunately, are still in that space where they're still trying to figure out, well, let's slap on the cookie banner and then we're good. Let's have this checkbox, right? And consumers, I don't think, realize that there's so much more that needs to be done to ensure that they can have more control of their data or what might be happening with their data. So I think that it'll be interesting to see what your thoughts are in terms of where this is going. And if you see any certain technologies that are coming out there, or even just, things around regulations that might push enterprises one way or the other to kind of force them to do this in a more transparent way, giving more control to consumers and also doing it in a more business savvy way for themselves, right?
Right. So when it comes to banners and you know, opt-in or opt-out banners and so on, we have to, like, my reaction to these is that, you know, this is a market having a kind of a preliminary reaction to a regulation, right? They have to do this. It's a legal conversation, honestly. It's not so much a technical conversation. We can have a technical conversation about how you implement this in order to achieve legal compliance, but that conversation is so much different than the actual technical conversation, which is how do you implement this so that you actually have a data governance policy in place, and of course have legal compliance. So these are the legal compliance veil is kind of easy to achieve by having that banner, but then there's so much more depth, and I think we're going to get there with time, right? From a consumer perspective, I would say that if we have a control point, as I said, where we can observe and advise regarding the consumer's behavior, then we just need to implement policies that are adhering to the consumer's preferences, and these preferences may change depending on age or geography or whatever not. I think that it's absolutely necessary to do that for consumers, because they need somebody to sort of guide them through this ecosystem, which is a complete jungle. They definitely cannot manage on their own, even if they're experts in the field. It's really hard to manage. And to that end, we are continuing the work. We want to continue producing technologies that will be protecting consumers from all this aggressive tracking and invasive data collection and so on and so forth. So we have active projects and active research in that space. On the enterprise side, things are a little bit more interesting, because I feel that enterprises will soon start understanding, you know, they had to check that box, the legal compliance box. So that was kind of quickly taken care of. But enterprises are beginning to understand that this collection of data and the aggressive use of all these tools that are available to them, when they're used overly aggressively, what happens is, yes, you know, they might enable some interesting business goals and growth and whatever not, but the other thing that they do is that they increase the enterprise's attack surface.
That's right.
Which is the term attack surface is somewhat technical, but it's a very, very key central term when it comes to security, and especially at enterprise security. So originally, what we would mean by attack surface is, you know, the servers that are connected to the internet and the services that are running and whether those are vulnerable and so on. But now, in today's business models and today's internet, the attack surface has expanded to include the machine learning models you use and whether those are exploitable or have some weakness, or, you know, whether they can be susceptible to adversarial machine learning attacks. They include the data that you hold, of whether those put a big red target on your back and you will be kind of an appealing sort of target for hackers, the liability you carry and the risk you carry with the kinds of decisions you've made and the policies you're enforcing or not enforcing.
Right.
So the implications go way beyond the simple legal checkbox that shows up when you're connecting to a website.
No, and that makes a lot of sense. And I think that's probably why we're seeing so much of this convergence as well, right? So a lot of these privacy and compliance use cases, at least with Tala, we see a lot of our customers and who we sell to, which is the application security team or the security teams, coming in with that use case, because now they're tasked to implement controls to ensure that their attack surface, because on their end, it's all about the attack surface and making sure that they're protected, is still intact. Because with compliance, I think that always, and I think we spoke about this initially as well, with compliance issues, you need to realize that it also indicates an increased attack surface. So you kind of have to balance that out. So what does that mean for the enterprise, right? And I think that's a really critical, important step from where it was before, which is these two silos not talking to each other, but now they're one and the same. So just moving along, Petros, and you spoke about this a little earlier too, around control points and what enterprises can do. And there are
Right.
solutions coming out in the market. And there's a range of this, right? So there's obviously client-side security where we play in Tala. There's network aspects of it in terms of security. I know you've worked through a lot of these pieces in your research. Where do you see sort of if there are any technologies coming out in any one of these spaces and anything in terms of trends that you see might be interesting or how it's evolved over the years? And maybe some takeaways at the end that we can talk about as well.
Right. So if you think about the data, the sensitive data that is being transmitted over the internet, let's just look at it very abstractly. Let's say I'm a customer or I'm a consumer, and I have some data that are valuable to myself as well as to somebody else for different reasons, maybe. And I interact with the internet and a service, and you have at any point in time, this remains true actually. Like you have three key components in this interaction. You have the endpoint, which is me on my computer doing what I do, or my on my phone. Then you have the network, which is this big, cloudy, opaque thing in the middle, and then you have whatever is at the other end of that connection, which nowadays is oftentimes a cloud-hosted service. It could be something else, obviously. It could be like a regular old school website in the older sense, but typically nowadays it's a cloud service. So your data kind of traverses this path, as we all know. So a few years ago, there was a big, let's say, belief, which I have to admit that I subscribed to that myself at the time, that there's a lot that we can do in the network. And that is kind of a very good centralized point for us to do things. And as a result, everything goes through the pipes. We can go sit on the pipe and then do our DLP and do our user behavioral analytics later on and all that good stuff, and create alerts, create protections, block things, and so on. And this is great. It worked very well, both from the privacy perspective as well as the security perspective. It gave us a lot of interesting solutions. And the problem, though, started a few years ago, where we realized that we might be losing visibility into the network, right?
Right.
And TLS 1.3 and Quick are two very good examples as to why, like the reason why those were developed is a completely different story. They were developed for for privacy by some people who were felt very strongly about the need for strong privacy. There are also business reasons that have to do with end-to-end control of the pipe and whatever not. Let's not go into the details. The point is that this is a reality. TLS 1.3 will have increasing adoption. Quick has been adopted quite a lot. Certificates are getting pinned for services and applications, so you have even less ability to inspect content like we used to do so before. And then this creates the black box we have very little visibility or reduced visibility into. And now we have to think about, go back to the control points question, like what are our control points? If our visibility inside the network is reduced, then what do we have to fall back on? And then from the image that I painted earlier, the 2 points that remain are the two endpoints, right? That's right. So where the data sink and the data source. The data sink oftentimes is, from a jurisdictional perspective, it's very limiting, right? If a service is hosted on AWS, right, there's only so much I can do to intercept or interfere or inspect or whatever not, right? There are some solutions there. I'm not completely outright rejecting this as an option, but there are jurisdictional limitations. So then we have to consider the other endpoint, which is the data source. And this is where anyone who has some sort of stake at the source, at the user's endpoint, needs to scratch their head and see, what do we do now? and what are the solutions available there. For a Navy vendor, for instance, like NortonLifeLock, we have an entire piece of software. We have an entire endpoint client, and that is a very powerful tool. We can inspect a lot of files, or we can see what's happening, possibly inspect a few things in the network, but again, we're running into the same problems.
That's right.
From a privacy perspective, as of recently, we see that there's a lot of movement on the browser side. And this is not something that we observe ourselves just because it's an interesting control point for us to enforce policies and to enforce all these, banner requests and whatever not. It's also something that we see because there is a movement by the major browser creators, manufacturers, like Google is constantly changing their APIs and the whole browser framework for Chrome, mostly to the better, but there are also some other changes that might warrant some discussion. Right. But they have announced changes in their tracking and cookie framework. They have announced changes for their manifest file and transitioning towards V3. Apple is doing the same. They make very intrusive changes into their browser so that they can protect and enforce policies and so on. And generally speaking, there's a lot of movement around the browser space, and we see browsers becoming, like, I would dare say, like, my background as a researcher is in operating systems, and I draw analogies in that sense. But the browser has become an entire platform. It's almost as if it's an entire operating system on its own, right? And you can program it, you can have applications for it, and so on. So that's something that's happening today. It's hot, it's there, and we need to pay attention, right?
Absolutely. And actually, you took our punchline away. That's what we always say, right? The browser is the new OS. I mean, that for better or for worse, that's where all of this is happening. And you hit on some interesting points at the end, right? Yes, Googles of the world, all of them doing things in their browser and with their cookie, sort of the implementation, if you may. In terms of warranting the next question, I wanted to just bring this up since we just spoke about it. If you really look at the fine print, yes, they might be limiting other vendors to have access to me as a user and my IP and other things, but they're still collecting that information to put me in this cohort is what they're talking about, right? So I think the question again lies is there's still a few players that might end up with a lot of very interesting information about me as a consumer. How all of that's going to translate out where multiple third parties have access to it is where that's interesting. And I think that's the sort of thing, at least with Tala, what we have when we talk about privacy and security, the first thing is just trying to understand who has access to that data, which is very interesting to say, hey, who has access to what my data might be, what they're doing with it, are they sharing it or oversharing it? And beyond that, if Googles of the world are the only ones collecting a lot of our data, then how do we police them, right? So that is where I think it's interesting for the consumer angle to first be aware, and can I then control what data some of these enterprises have of me, right? So I think that's the question, how all of this is going to kind of pan out with regulations.
Yeah, it is a big question because we also need to understand, it's a little early. We don't know enough about how they're going to implement this and how it's going to work. Because we do a lot of work in that space right now and a lot of research in that space, we had to take into consideration what the future is going to look like. So we tried to do a little bit of a deep dive into that whole proposal for federated methods for this work. And it's not clear, there's not enough information, but from what I'm seeing right now, I have a lot of questions, right? Yeah. Because, for instance, one possible thing that may go wrong depending on the implementation is that you may be placed as a consumer or as a user, you may be placed in a particular cohort based on your interests, right? But placing you in a particular cohort may reduce the search space from hundreds of millions to 1,000 people. And then it's so much easier to identify me uniquely among 1,000 people. Just a small browser thing like a font that I have on my browser that can be fingerprinted is just maybe is enough to identify me. Right. And then this these other assumptions that are being made regarding how the data democracy model that they're trying to achieve means that anyone who is interested in tracking activity, they may request this information will live on the browser, apparently, based on what we've seen. So this is sitting on the browser, and everyone who wants access to that information can have access to that information under this, democratic model.
That's right.
Okay, so basically what this tells me is that tiny tracker from, tiny country X suddenly has access to all the same information that Google has access to. So now I'm not just worried about the big elephants in the room like Google and Facebook and whomever else, like the top 10s.
Right.
But everybody has the same access to all that information. I'm not sure how this is going to be implemented so that it's safe.
That's right.
And not being sure means that A, we have to wait, and B, we have to plan for contingencies.
That's right.
So I'm not saying it's wrong, don't get me wrong, and anyone in the audience shouldn't get me wrong. I'm just saying that as a researcher, I've been conditioned to be skeptical, and I'm just going to wait and see how things play out.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that's the reason I brought it up, because I think we always talk about it. We're on the other end of sort of the tunnel, right? We're talking to customers directly when they're ready to implement or thinking of implementing it. And I think talking to somebody like you who's doing the research well before anything is productized, it's very interesting to see how you're thinking about the space, but also the implications at the very end, because that's a long process, right? A long, drawn out, thought out process.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's great. And I think we spoke about a lot of topics. Just to sort of summarize and tie it all together, we spoke a little bit about the various solutions, if you may, that, enterprises need to be looking at or thinking about, what consumers have access to today and what that might be. So just in terms of, to summarize all of this, what are sort of, maybe let's start with enterprises, because that's obviously what you work in Norton. What are sort of the top 3 takeaways that you think, based on privacy and their security of data, that you think consumers should start thinking about more, take away from as next steps that they can do?
Right. So for consumers, I would say that we need to work very hard as security professionals. We need to work very hard to make it easy for them. It's very difficult. And we need to find ways to make this sort of, I used the analogy earlier of like sort of holding their hand through this mess, right? So that's one key takeaway. The other key takeaway is the enablement piece that I said earlier, that we need to make consumers able to make decisions for themselves so that they can understand it. Like, forget about these page-long terms and conditions and all that stuff. That doesn't work. That's like necessary from a legal standpoint, and I appreciate and respect that. But from the consumer standpoint, we need something that will guide them to what's best for them, and they can make that decision. We're not going to bias the process, but we need to expose them to enough information to enable them to make the best decision for themselves when we can't protect them outright.
That's right.
And the last thing is that this process is not strictly technical. We can't achieve this unless we have a very, very good cooperation with other disciplines like anthropologists, sociologists, people that do user studies, people who understand human behavior, so that we can get to that point. And this is basically the kind of work that we're looking at, that we're doing, that we're hoping that we'll release soon, and see how the market responds.
That's great. Yeah, no, that's an interesting point. The human aspect or the people aspect. We talk about processes, but that's past the, study how human behavior is on the web.
Mm-hmm.
And in terms of enterprises, you've touched on it as well, in terms of the control points. Are there any sort of last thoughts around how enterprises should look at this problem, or not only just break down the challenges, but how they can move this forward to getting to that space, where both consumers and enterprises have this harmony?
So for enterprises, even though at my current position, I don't directly work for enterprise products, I obviously have a lot of experience from prior work and a lot of sort of observations from what's going on. And I would say that we kind of went through the first phase of the regulations, the infancy, let's say, of the regulations, where everybody had to scramble and create something to be compliant, right? I feel like now we're transitioning into a space where, you know, we're going to have like the adolescence or the middle age or whatever you want to call it, where we need to get a little bit more serious about the way we implement it. Like, it's understandable that people had to scramble and put something together with duct tape and, you know, ropes. But now we need to make it a little bit more solid and a little bit more well thought out in terms of how it's implemented, not just from a legal checkbox standpoint, but also from a data protection standpoint. So I think that enterprises need to keep thinking about this, take it a little bit more seriously, think deeper about the implications and the liability of the data creates, and really be careful about how they use data, what they collect, what they store, what they discard. Apply this principle of least privilege and least data, I would say, in this particular case, right? So that you can stay safe. And then take a step back and reconsider the control points. Like, where do you sit where you can see things? Your current network-based solution, will that be enough down the road? I'm not saying it's worthless. I'm not saying by no means. I think it has its value, but will that be enough? Do you need another control point that will help you with compliance as well as business development? Do you need to be in the browser? Do you need to be at the endpoint? Do you need to be in the cloud? Where do you want to go to have control? Yeah. Depending on your application and your business, of course, right?
Yeah. Yeah. That's a great point. I think thinking about your control points, because often we talk to, customers and they think about, server-side security, network security, but obviously with the web the way it is today and the browser being sort of the new OS, that's where majority of the data that you're collecting about consumers is coming in. So if that's left open, then, there's a huge gap. Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you. That was great. Maybe we start, since we're about 40 minutes in, we have a few questions coming in. Maybe we'll start with some of the Q&A. And you've touched on this, Petros, but do you think increasing privacy regulations might result in a decline in online tracking by companies?
I don't have a crystal ball. I don't have like a magic oracle. But I think that the balance between regulations and online tracking is going to be, I don't know if it's necessarily going to be an adversarial relationship between the two. It seems the intuitive thing is that they will have an adversarial relationship. But eventually I feel that we need to reach a point of compromise where they will just go hand in hand, so that we can have reasonable regulation and reasonable protection, as well as reasonable platforms for businesses to thrive. You can't really shut that off. It drives the entire internet market right now, right? You can't just flip a switch and say, everything is gone. It's not as simple as that.
That's right.
So it's going to be something more symbiotic rather than, the one trying to kill the other.
Absolutely. And you touched on the business needs aspect of it. Business, as you know, it cannot shut down, right? I mean, how often do we now with COVID go into stores, or I guess ending tomorrow in California, but absolutely. And I think this is something you've also touched on, and it's more around the privacy landscape. How do you see it evolve in the next 5 to 10 years? And you touched on the fact that now talking about the control point, was there anything more there that you want to talk about on the evolution?
So the evolution of the landscape, the one thing I want to mention is that there's a lot of things that are going to happen in the next few years. And it's only, I'm not being here like a magician predicting something specific, but it's the nature of technology. Cars are going to become more autonomous. Smart devices for the home are going to become more prevalent and whatnot. Smart devices like phones, like everything is going to evolve, obviously. when it comes to privacy, I think that the current momentum about, first of all, I hope that the momentum doesn't go away. There is some momentum right now around privacy, driven both by technologists and regulators and other stakeholders. I hope that doesn't go away, but most importantly, what the result and the effect of this momentum and this attention to privacy is going to make people to introduce privacy as a design parameter for the future. The reality we live today was designed based on a number of other factors, but privacy was not a design parameter back in the day, right? So what many people call privacy by design, which is like a nice, catchy term, is actually a real thing, right? It's not just like a buzzword. So the products that are going to go out 5 or 10 years from now, I'm hoping and I believe that they will have privacy as one of the elements in the design process, besides efficiency, security, whatever else needs to go there. And the reason why I'm saying this is because we've seen this play out before. Like 10, 20 years ago, security was not a design parameter.
That's right.
Now it is. Maybe 10 years from now, privacy will be a design parameter, much in the same way that security became a design parameter.
That's right. Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. As a framework, we have a lot of things in place for security by design, right? And implement, that was one of the questions around development, code level implementation. All of that is pretty much well thought out in that CI/CD pipeline, where the checks and, who has to sign off before. What is that framework for privacy? It's still yet to be defined in some sense, right? I mean, there are some things that we can do where we can check where the code is coming from, the reputation, but is that enough, or is there sort of a repository? And I think there's a lot in the new cybersecurity task force as well that is coming down. They're talking about a lot of things as well in terms of frameworks that enterprises can follow, the fact that we all need to, talk about where our code comes from. So it's kind of interesting to see that. And absolutely, I think that's where it is. A lot of other questions you've covered. I think just final thoughts before we kind of call it a day. And if there's anything else you want to touch on that I didn't ask you about.
No, I think that my primary thinking is what I just said. There's a lot of momentum around privacy. We should jump on that train and kind of make the most of the momentum. There are a few exciting things happening from different stakeholders. I'm very eager to see how they play out. We are working on some exciting things. I know you guys are also working on some exciting things. So we should all contribute and make this a success story for the next few years as we're inventing the future of privacy.
Absolutely. I think you said that right. We probably have to have this check-in every 6 to 12 months to see what our progress is as an industry, leading this effort. But thank you again very much for your time. I hope you enjoyed this discussion as much as I did, and hope our viewers did as well. And we will be in touch. Hope to do many more of these in the future. Thanks.
Perfect. Petros. Thanks for having me. Thanks. Bye-bye.